My name is Audrey Callahan. I'm 31 years old. 6 months ago, the Coast Guard called to tell me my husband had been lost at sea, and for 6 months, I believed them. Then my neighbor knocked on my door at 11 o'clock at night, holding her phone with shaking hands, and everything I thought I knew fell apart. But before I tell you what she showed me, please like and subscribe to the channel and drop your city or country in the comments below. Now let me tell you what really happened. 6 months ago, my husband was on a research vessel off the coast of Maine. His name is Colin. Colin Callahan. He'd been a marine biologist for almost 8 years, and every few months his team would go out for 2 to 3 weeks at a time, collecting water samples, tagging fish populations, logging data that most people never think about, but that matters more than they realize. I was used to him being gone. It was part of our life together. I always hated the days before he left, the quiet dread I'd feel watching him pack his gear bag in the hallway. But I never said anything because I knew how much the work meant to him. The morning he left for that last trip, we had coffee together at the kitchen table like always. I remember the light coming through the window was really pretty, that kind of early October light that's gold and thin at the same time. He was reading something on his phone and I was watching him, and I remember thinking, I love this man so much it's almost inconvenient. He looked up and caught me staring and said, "What?" And I just shook my head and said, "Nothing, just looking." He smiled and went back to his phone. I didn't know that was the last normal morning we would have for a very long time. 12 days into the trip, there was a storm, a bad one. The kind that comes up faster than the forecast suggests and hits harder than anyone expected. The vessel was a mid-sized research ship, not enormous, but not a small boat either. They had protocol for weather events. They had safety equipment. They had radios. But the storm was brutal, and somewhere in the middle of it, Colin went overboard. The Coast Guard called me at 6:47 in the morning. I know the exact time because I stared at the clock on the microwave for what felt like forever after I hung up. They told me there had been an incident. They told me Colin had gone over the side and that a search had been launched immediately. They were doing everything they could. They asked me if I had family nearby. I remember answering all their questions in a voice that didn't sound like mine. For 3 days, they searched. I drove up to the coast with my sister-in-law and we sat in a motel room outside Rockland and waited. The other researchers on the vessel were devastated. One of them, a woman named Dr. Price, who had worked with Colin for 4 years, sat with us for 2 hours one afternoon and held my hand and said almost nothing. She didn't need to say anything. We both knew what the water was like. We both knew how long a person could survive in the North Atlantic in October. On the 4th day, the Coast Guard told me they were suspending active search operations. They said they would continue passive monitoring. They said they were deeply sorry. I drove home alone. My sister-in-law wanted to come with me, but I needed the drive. 4.5 hours down I-95, just me and the road and the knowledge that Colin wasn't coming home. By the time I pulled into our driveway in Portland, it was dark. I sat in the car for a while before I went inside. The house was exactly the way we'd left it. His running shoes were by the front door. There was a half-finished grocery list on the counter in his handwriting. Greek yogurt, coffee filters, that hot sauce he liked from the little shop on Congress Street. I left the list exactly where it was. I didn't move it for months. The weeks that followed were the kind of grief I don't have words for even now. People brought food. My mother came and stayed for 2 weeks. Friends called and texted, and some of them came over and sat with me, and I was grateful for all of it, genuinely. But the moment everyone left and the house got quiet again, it came back like a tide. I'd reach for my phone to text him something stupid I'd seen online and then remember. I'd wake up at 2 in the morning and feel the empty side of the bed and just lie there staring at the ceiling. I went back to work after about 3 weeks because staying home was making it worse. I'm a physical therapist. I work with people who are trying to rebuild function after injuries and surgeries, and there's something grounding about that kind of work, being useful in a concrete way. But even at work, I'd sometimes be in the middle of a session and catch myself thinking about Colin and have to breathe through it without letting my face show anything. 6 months pass like that, slow and heavy and gray, like weather that just doesn't break. Then it was a Tuesday night in April. I'd had a long day, and I was on the couch with a blanket and a glass of wine watching something on TV that I wasn't really paying attention to. It was almost 11 o'clock. I was about to go to bed, and then someone knocked on my door. I live in a quiet neighborhood. Nobody knocks at 11 on a Tuesday. I almost didn't answer it, but the knock came again, harder this time, and when I looked through the window, I could see it was my neighbor from across the street. Her name is Bet. She's in her early 60s, retired, and she and I have been friendly for years in that comfortable, low-key way where you wave from your cars and occasionally end up talking in the driveway for an hour. She's steady, practical. Not the type to show up at your door at night looking rattled, but she looked rattled. I opened the door and she was standing on my porch in her coat over her pajamas, holding her phone with both hands. "Audrey," she said. "I'm sorry to come so late. I almost didn't come at all. But I've been sitting with this for 2 hours and I couldn't not show you." My stomach dropped. "What is it?" "Come inside," I said. And she came in and we stood in my hallway and she turned her phone toward me. It was a Facebook post from a small, nonprofit organization called Coastal Haven Initiative, a group that does community outreach in fishing villages and small coastal towns in Nova Scotia. The post was a few photos from what looked like a fundraiser dinner. People around tables, volunteers in matching shirts. Normal stuff. Except in the background of the second photo, standing near a window and not really part of the main scene. There was a man. He was thinner than I remembered. He had a beard he'd never had before. He was turned slightly away from the camera, but the way he was standing, the exact angle of his shoulders, the specific way he tilted his head, I felt the recognition before I'd even fully processed what I was seeing. My hand came up and covered my mouth. "I know," Bet said quietly. "I know. I could be wrong. I almost talked myself out of coming over. But Audrey, that jawline, that posture." "It's him," I whispered. My voice came out strange and thin. "That's Colin." We stood in my hallway at 11 o'clock at night staring at a photo on a phone. My hands had started shaking. "Bet," I said. "How did you even see this?" She explained that her daughter volunteered with a sister organization in New Brunswick and had shared the post earlier that evening. Bet had been scrolling through her feed, half asleep, when she stopped on it. She'd almost kept scrolling. She'd told herself she was seeing what she wanted to see, that grief does things to perception, that it wasn't fair to come knock on my door in the middle of the night over a blurry background figure in a fundraiser photo. But she'd come anyway. Because she couldn't not. I zoomed in on the photo. The image quality wasn't great. It was a wide shot taken in a dim room, but the more I looked, the more certain I felt. That was the scar on his forearm from a fishing accident years ago. I could just barely make it out. The pale mark along the inside of his left arm. I was the one who'd driven him to urgent care that day. I was the one who'd held his hand while they put in the stitches. "What do we do?" Bet asked. "We contact them," I said. I found the Coastal Haven Initiative's contact information in about 40 seconds. They had a website with an email address and a phone number. It was too late to call, but I wrote them an email right there in my hallway, standing up, typing it out on my phone, with Bet reading over my shoulder. I explained who I was. I explained who Colin was. I explained that my husband had been declared lost at sea 6 months ago following an incident off the coast of Maine, and that I believed I recognized him in the background of their recent Facebook post. I kept it as clear and factual as I could, but my hands were shaking so badly I had to fix 3 typos. Then we waited. Bet offered to stay and I said yes. We sat at my kitchen table and I made tea even though neither of us really wanted tea, because I needed to do something with my hands. The house was very quiet. Every time my phone lit up, I grabbed it, but it was just background notifications, nothing from them. At 12:40 in the morning, an email came in. We both stopped breathing. I opened it. The message was from a woman named Miss Bet Theriault, the volunteer coordinator at Coastal Haven. She wrote that she'd seen my email and wanted to respond right away despite the late hour, because she understood this couldn't wait. She said there was indeed a man staying with a host family affiliated with their organization, a man who had been found on the shoreline by a lobsterman near Digby, Nova Scotia, approximately 5.5 months ago. He had been suffering from severe hypothermia, multiple injuries consistent with a prolonged time in the water, and had no identification on him when he was found. A chair scraped back. I stood up without meaning to. The email continued. She said the man had recovered physically, largely thanks to the family who had taken him in and the local clinic that treated him. But she said his memory had been significantly affected. She used the phrase profound retrograde amnesia, and that while he could function day to day, he had no reliable memories from before waking up in that house. He didn't know who he was. He had been living for 5.5 months not knowing his own name. I read the email 3 times. Then I looked at Bet. "He's alive," I said. My voice broke completely on the last word. Bet reached across the table and grabbed both my hands. I called Miss Theriot at 7 the next morning. She was already at her desk. She was kind and careful in the way she spoke, clearly aware of how much weight the conversation carried. She told me they had gently shown the man the inquiry without telling him the specifics, and that he had consented to the possibility of someone coming to see him. He hadn't reacted with recognition, she said, but he hadn't said no. I booked a flight to Halifax for the following morning. My sister-in-law wanted to come. Bet wanted to come. I understood why, but I needed to do this part by myself. If it was really Colin, I needed to see his face without anyone watching mine. The flight was just over 2 hours. I barely slept the night before. I packed a bag and then unpacked it and repacked it and finally just zipped it shut and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a while. On the nightstand was a photo of us from our honeymoon, standing on a beach somewhere with our shoes off, both of us laughing at something that's not in the frame. I picked it up and put it in my bag. The drive from Halifax to the small town where he was staying took about 90 minutes along the coast highway. The landscape was beautiful in a stark, end-of-winter way. Bare trees, iron-gray water, the occasional white farmhouse set back from the road. It looked like the edge of the world. I thought about Colin being found here, washed up on the shoreline, not knowing his own name. I thought about him waking up in a stranger's house with no memory of me, of us, of our whole life together. The thought was almost too much to sit with. The host family's house was a white 2-story about a mile outside of town, set close to the water with a gravel driveway and a large vegetable garden that was just starting to show green at the edges. A woman met me at the door. May. Arsenault, the woman who had essentially become Colin's caretaker for the past several months. She was a sturdy, warm woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and flour on her hands, and the moment she opened the doors, she looked at me and said, "He's out back. He walks down to the water in the mornings." I thanked her and walked around the side of the house. The yard sloped down toward a small dock at the edge of a cove, and standing at the end of the dock, looking out at the water, was my husband. He was thinner. His hair was longer. He was wearing a heavy canvas jacket I'd never seen before. But the way he stood, weight shifted to his left foot, hands in his pockets, shoulders slightly hunched against the cold. That was exactly how Colin stood whenever he was thinking hard about something. I had watched him stand exactly that way 100 times. I stopped walking. I couldn't move for a moment. Then he must have heard my footsteps on the dock because he turned around. His face was Colin's face. The same eyes, the same jaw, the faint scar at the corner of his mouth from when he'd gotten stitches there at 13 years old. A story I'd heard a dozen times. He looked at me with an expression that was open and cautious and polite, the expression of someone meeting a stranger. "Hi," he said. That one word in that voice. After 6 months of silence, I had to press my hand hard against my sternum just to stay upright. "Hi," I said back. My voice was remarkably steady considering what was happening inside my chest. He studied my face with a slight frown. Not unkind. "You're the one who contacted them," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, they told me you think you know me." "I don't think," I said. "I know." He looked at me for a long moment. There was something in his expression. Not recognition exactly, but something that wasn't entirely the face of a stranger either. Like a word on the tip of your tongue. Like a song you know you've heard but can't place. I don't remember anything, he said quietly. I want you to know that. I don't want to give you false hope. I'm not asking you to remember anything today, I told him. I just needed to see you. He nodded slowly. Then he looked back out at the water. After a moment, he said, "What was I like?" Something about the past tense of that question hit me hard. I had to swallow before I could answer. "You were funny," I said. "Quieter than people expected when they first met you. You were obsessed with data and spreadsheets. But you also cried in nature documentaries, which you thought I didn't know about, but I absolutely did." I paused. "You made the same grocery list every week and always forgot to buy the one thing we actually ran out of." He turned and looked at me again. Still no recognition. But he didn't look away. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm sorry I can't." He stopped. Shook his head. "You don't have to apologize," I said. The doctor at the local clinic explained the situation to me that afternoon with the patience of someone who had dealt with difficult medical conversations many times. He said the combination of the trauma, the prolonged hypothermia, and what appeared to be a head injury sustained before or during Colin's time in the water had produced a significant and unusual memory disruption. He said it wasn't impossible that memories could return, but that it might be gradual and it might be triggered by sensory experiences, sounds, smells, familiar environments, rather than by someone simply telling him facts about his life. I stayed in Nova Scotia for 4 days that first trip. I didn't push. I sat with Colin and me, Arsenal at dinner. I told him stories about our life the way you tell someone a story about people they never met, not demanding that he recognize himself in them, just letting him hear them. He listened carefully to everything. He asked questions sometimes. Where did we live? How long had we been married? What did I do for work? He was trying to build a picture from the outside in since the inside was unavailable to him. On the third day, he asked if I had photos. I showed him everything I had on my phone. Our apartment, our wedding, vacations and holidays and random Tuesday nights and all the small accumulated evidence of a shared life. He looked at each photo carefully, holding the phone close, his face very still. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he stopped on the honeymoon photo, the one from the beach that I packed in my bag. He looked at it for almost a full minute. "You're laughing," he said finally. "We both are." "What were we laughing at?" "A pelican," I said. It landed about 10 feet away and just stared at us like it was extremely unimpressed. "You said it looked like your old department head." He looked at the photo for another moment. Then something moved across his face. I don't know how else to describe it. Something shifted, like a door moving slightly in a breeze. "That's funny," he said quietly, almost to himself. I flew home after that fourth day. I cried most of the flight, but somewhere over the Atlantic, which felt both cruel and appropriate, I let myself feel something I hadn't felt in 6 months. Not grief, not the hollow certainty of loss, something smaller and more fragile and much more terrifying: hope. I went back to Nova Scotia 3 more times over the next 2 months. I brought things each time: his worn copy of a field guide he loved that had been on our bookshelf, a playlist of songs we used to listen to on road trips, a blanket his grandmother had made that still lived in our closet, sensory pieces of our life. Some of them landed and some of them didn't, but I kept coming, and he kept being there when I arrived, and somewhere in those visits we built something new. A relationship that wasn't quite what we'd had before, but wasn't nothing either. He was still Colin in all the ways that showed up in behavior, the way he thought, the things that made him laugh, the questions he asked about the research he couldn't remember doing. He was still him. He just didn't know it yet. The breakthrough, when it finally came, wasn't dramatic the way I'd imagined it. I'd spent a lot of months imagining some sudden flood of recognition, his eyes going wide, his whole face opening up, his arms around me. That's not what happened. What happened was a Sunday morning in late June. I'd driven up the night before and stayed at a small inn in town. Colin and I had gotten into the habit of walking the shoreline trail behind me, Arsenal's property in the mornings. We walked in mostly comfortable silence with occasional conversation. That morning, the light was extraordinary, clear and gold and bright off the water, and we'd stopped at a flat rock that jutted out over the cove, where we'd started stopping regularly because the view was particularly good. We were just standing there, and I started talking, not about us, not about his memory or his past, just talking the way I talked to Colin before all of this. About a difficult patient I was working with, about a funny thing my mother had said on the phone, about the way the light was hitting the water right at that moment, and he said very quietly, "You used to do this at home." I turned to look at him. "You'd talk through your day," he said. His voice was careful, like he was trying to hold something fragile. "In the kitchen, while you were making coffee." He stopped, his brow furrowed. "There's a window above the sink. The light comes in at a certain angle in the morning." My heart stopped. The window above our kitchen sink. The morning light. That was real. That was ours. "Yes," I said. I kept my voice very calm because I was terrified that if I showed how much this moment meant, something would break. "That's right." He turned and looked at me. His eyes were different than they'd been any time before. Not fully open, but opening. "Audrey," he said. "My name." In his voice. After 8 months. I didn't run to him. I just stood very still and let it happen. Let whatever was coming through finally come through. His face was doing something complicated, like a man trying to understand something vast and impossible, and his eyes filled up. And then he was crying in the quiet way that Colin always cried, turning his head slightly to the side like he was hoping I wouldn't notice. I noticed. I stepped closer and put my hand on his arm, and he put his hand over mine, and we stood on that rock above the cove while the light moved across the water, and neither of us spoke for a long time. There was so much to figure out after that. So much that still took time. His full memory didn't flood back in one moment. It came in pieces over the following weeks. Some things clearly, some things still hazy, some things maybe gone for good. The doctors said that was normal, or as normal as anything could be in a situation like this. We worked with neurologists back in Maine. We did couples counseling because we both needed help navigating what we'd each been through separately during those 8 months. There were hard days. There were conversations that were painful in ways I hadn't anticipated, and some that were unexpectedly easy. We're still working through it. I don't want to pretend otherwise. But Colin came home. He is home. He's sitting in the other room right now while I record this, and if I listen carefully, I can hear him doing exactly what he always does on Sunday afternoons. Pulling up research papers he never quite gets around to reading and moving them into folders on his laptop in a system that makes sense only to him. Some things the water didn't take. I used to think the hardest moment of my life was that morning the Coast Guard called, but I don't think that anymore. The hardest moment was standing on a dock in Nova Scotia looking at my husband's face while he looked back at me like I was a stranger, and choosing to stay anyway. Choosing to believe that love was still there even when it couldn't remember itself. It was. It always was. I've thought a lot about what made the difference. Not in a grand, sweeping way, just quietly, the way you think about things when you're washing dishes at night and the house is calm. And what I keep coming back to is this. Nothing that happened to me and Colin was fair. The storm wasn't fair. The months of not knowing were not fair. Standing on that dock and watching my husband look at me like I was a stranger. There are no words for how unfair that was. But fairness was never the thing that got us through. What got us through was smaller and harder than fairness. It was Bet sitting with a photo on her phone for 2 hours, arguing with herself about whether to cross the street. She could have talked herself out of it. Most people would have, but something in her, some basic commitment to doing right by another person, even when it was inconvenient and uncertain, made her put her coat on and knock on my door anyway. That mattered more than she'll probably ever know. There's a kind of moral courage in small acts like that, the ones nobody sees coming and nobody will write about, but that changed everything. And then there was the part that was on me, Figuring out that I couldn't just tell Colin who he was and expect that to fix anything, that took a while to understand. My instinct in those early visits was to give him information, to explain our life to him, to present evidence, as if love were a case that could be argued. It wasn't until I stopped trying to convince him and just started being myself around him, talking the way I actually talk, noticing the things I actually notice, that something shifted. It took me time and some painful clarity to understand the difference. That's not intelligence in the test-taking sense. It's the kind of thinking that requires you to look honestly at what you're doing and ask whether it's actually working, and then change course when the answer is no. The hardest part, though, was just the endurance of it. Going back 3 times, 4 times, not knowing if anything would ever come back to him, staying in that inn outside town and lying in a strange bed, wondering if I was doing the right thing or just prolonging something that would never resolve. Resilience sounds like a strong word, like something muscular and impressive. It didn't feel like that from the inside. It felt like just not stopping. Like deciding on a Tuesday morning to buy another plane ticket even though you're tired and scared and there are no guarantees. I think about what I would tell someone going through something like this. I don't think I'd say anything inspirational. I'd probably just say, do the next right thing, even when you can't see past it. Be honest about what's working and what isn't, and be willing to change. And keep going past the point where it feels reasonable to keep going. Because sometimes the thing you're waiting for is just on the other side of the moment you almost quit. Colin is making coffee in the kitchen right now. I can hear the grinder. He does it the same way he always did. A little too long, and the coffee ends up slightly over-extracted, which I've gently mentioned approximately 40 times over the years of our marriage. He has not adjusted his technique. Some things the water didn't take, and some things you don't know how much you love until you almost lose them for good.